welcome to ThePrint SoftCover, where we launch interesting books for you to read. And today we have with us a very special guest, Mr. Rizwan Virk, who is a successful entrepreneur, a venture capitalist, also a faculty at the Arizona State University. And he has written a lot of books, but today we are going to talk about this book, which is called The Wisdom of a Yogi. And I'm just going to open this book for our viewers to see. So here's the new book that we're going to talk about today, Wisdom of a Yogi, Lessons for Modern Seekers from from Autobiography of a Yogi, which is the autobiography of Paramahansa Yogananda. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to ThePrint.
Well, thanks for having me on. Great to be here with you.
Yeah. So, Autobiography of a Yogi, I remember when I was in college, it used to be a very popular book among the students as well. I mean, I remember I got my first copy when I was in first year after I heard recommendations from people like Virat Kohli, who used to be like, oh, this book has changed my life. So I think it's fairly popular among the young readers. But what you have done in this is that you have reinterpreted Yogananda's teachings for the modern readers, for the 21st century readers, young people especially. So why did you feel the need to, sort of reimagine those lessons from his life?
Yeah, absolutely. So, Yogananda came from India to the United States back in 1920. So it was literally 100 years ago, that he made the journey. And it was on the 75th anniversary of the release of his book, Autobiography of a Yogi, that I was asked by HarperCollins India to write this book about some of the lessons that I had learned, because this book had been a favorite book of mine for many years. I first read it in the 1990s, and the book was written initially primarily for an American audience, but it's now gone back to India and become quite popular there. And so the book was very popular here in the 1960s when yoga and Eastern spirituality and religions became very popular with the young people here. But many of those young people have now grown up, and in the West, the book tends to be more popular with what we call the baby boomers, the generation that was young in the 1960s, who are relatively old today. And so, one of the things that Yogananda did during his time was that he was a bit of a reformer, and he would bring, ancient, Vedic ideas of karma, of meditation, of samadhi, of cities. He would bring those, into English, but he would use modern technology and modern analogies to bring those lessons to the modern world at that time, which was the mid 20th century. And so, the latest technology at that time was the motion picture, the telephone and the radio, and then eventually the television. And so the book has quite a few references to the technology of the time, and trying to use that to describe, the ideas that the world is Maya, or an illusion, or, if you look back at the Sanskrit words, it means a carefully crafted illusion. And so because Yogananda did that in those years, I felt that 100 years later, we have a generation that's grown up with a new wave of technology. We're all on the internet. We all have computers. We have smartphones. We play video games. We stream on YouTube, right? And so we needed to bring a whole different set of language and metaphors, I think, to show people that the stories that Yogananda told were, just as relevant today. And if he were alive today, I believe he would do the same thing. He would use the metaphors and the technology of today. And he was seen as a bit of a reformer in his time. And there were, many traditionalists who were unhappy with him at the time, because he used things like the mail to teach, about yoga and meditation, or he used these analogies of the motion picture, et cetera. So that was part of the reason why I ended up writing this book.
And you have a very interesting background, in technology, business, and even video games. And you were mentioning about it also. So when did you first got inspired by the teachings of Yogananda, and how did you first came across this idea that, you have to write this book?
Yeah, so I graduated from MIT with a degree in computer science, quite a few years ago now, back in the 1990s, and it was during that time that, as I was starting to be an entrepreneur, I started to notice that there were things happening in my entrepreneurial career, obstacles that we all face, and these obstacles sometimes required a bit of intuition to get past these, and so I started to look for different teachers, around me that taught about different mental techniques, different meditation techniques. And that's when I stumbled upon a Buddhist teacher who was actually a Caucasian white guy in the US who told me that I needed to read Autobiography of a Yogi. And so, I went and read the book at that point in time. And then I've reread it pretty much every year or every few years. And, it's had an impact here in the US in the technology industry, which is what I was doing as an entrepreneur. And then later I was building video games. And what happened was, as I built video games, I became an investor, a venture capitalist in the latest technology. And one of the latest technologies was virtual reality. And so I had put on a headset a few years back, and I was playing a table tennis game. And as I was playing this game, for a moment, I forgot that I was inside a video game, right? It felt as if the table was real and my ping pong game was real, so much so that I tried to, put my paddle down on the table and I tried to lean against the table, but there was no table. It was all an illusion. And so that's what led me to this idea that the universe could be like the Matrix, a technological computer simulation, and that this was very close to some of the ideas that Yogananda had been teaching at the time. And, he used the motion picture as an analogy that said that, if someone dies or if someone's suffering, we think there's a lot of suffering. But if they're an actor in a movie, it's just the projection, and that actor is still there, in the same way that if we're inside a video game. And so I wrote a book about this idea, and I pulled in a lot of Yogananda's quotes and teachings, as well as from other religious traditions. And it was during that time that I ended up having some health issues. And during that time, I reread Autobiography of Yogi, which I often do during challenging times. And then I said, well, what other books might I read that are like this? And then I, looked around and wrote some articles for these other books. And I realized, well, there are other books like it, but not really. There really aren't that many books that have, the combination of lessons and stories that he has. And so that's when I began to think about this. And then suddenly I was approached, by HarperCollins in India to write this book on the 75th anniversary. And so it wasn't that I was planning to write a book on Yogananda. I was reading the book and learning the lessons for myself. But then the universe gave me this task. That's how I like to do it. In the same way, one of the lessons in the book is that sometimes the universe gives you a task which you might not be prepared for. Now, in 1920, Yogananda, known as Mukunda, and he had just become a Swami. He was a young Swami, and they needed a representative at the Congress of World Religions, which was held in Boston. Now, Yogananda barely spoke English at the time, right? So he was not necessarily the most qualified Swami. He was not the most experienced Swami to bring, this tradition to the West. And yet that was the task that the universe had set in front of him. And he got, a vision, what I call a clue that this is the right direction for you. And then he got an invitation, and then he decided to follow that invitation. And that's exactly what happened in my case with this book, was that I had gotten an invitation and the universe set this task in front of me. And I realized that a lot of what I had been writing about, oftentimes quoting Yogananda, was very relevant in writing this book to bring Autobiography of a Yogi up to date for the modern world.
If we talk about self-help books, I wouldn't exactly call it a self-help book, but among the young generation, there's an aversion to some of this genre, I would say, which tend to become a bit preachy. So how would you say that this book is different from that usual genre of self-help books? because it doesn't has these elements of philosophy and then some modern examples also. So how would you say it's different?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's different in the sense that, this is not another self-help book that says follow these 14 steps,
Yeah.
and you will be successful. Now, I know as an entrepreneur who's been very successful in my business ventures, that doesn't always work, right? Simply reading a book and following the steps is not what's going to lead you to success. However, one of the most important ingredients of being successful in the world and feeling successful is to leverage your personal strengths and have some insight about yourself and the things that you are being led to in this life. And that is a part of what I like to call our internal energetic patterns, or to use a video game terms, it's the types of quests that have been put in front of us, right? And many young people play video games, so they understand this idea of quests and achievements. And so by understanding ourselves, we can basically find a better place and be more successful and feel more successful in our lives. And usually we have a sense of that already, and it's different for each person. If you had asked me in high school, what I was going to do, I would tell you, well, I'm probably going to be an entrepreneur in the computer industry, and then I'm going to be a writer. And I thought that transition would happen at the age of 28 or the age of 30, which I thought was old at the time. Now, I had kind of the right sense. That's exactly what happened in my career, but it happened over a longer period of time. And so having some knowledge about ourselves is what puts us in a position to be more successful. When Yogananda was young, he had this vision where he saw these yogis meditating in the Himalayas. And he said, "Who are you guys?" And in his vision, they said, "We are the yogis of the Himalayas." And so he spent most of his childhood thinking he was going to run off to the Himalayas. And there are many great stories in the autobiography where, as a boy, he tries to run away so he can go live with the yogis in the Himalayas. And each time his older brother, Ananta, sent by his father, would grab him. And sometimes they had to, go on the railroad to Rishikesh and get him back. But he thought he was going to be a wandering monk. He did actually end up becoming a wandering monk, but he was not wandering around in the Himalayas. He wandered around in the United States for most of his adult life. He was on a train and probably put on more miles than any Swami since Shankara, since Shankara, way back over 1,000 years ago. And so he had the general sense of what he wanted to do, but he had to follow the clues to find the specific task that was set out to him. And that's why I view this not as a traditional self-help book, but really as a book which through stories, the stories that Yogananda told and the stories of modern academics, professors, movie producers, and just regular young people getting job computer programmers. Through these stories, we can get better knowledge of ourselves, which helps to reveal what some of our karma is.
Right. And did you feel a challenge when you were writing this book that you have to stay true to his original teachings while making it more relevant for the readers?
Well, I liked the stories so much that he told that for me, that was the way to make it authentic, was to really ground all the lessons that I tell in this book. And you can think of it as kind of a condensed version of Autobiography of a Yogi. But those stories were so memorable, whether they were stories of, a levitating yogi, stories of a Muslim fakir who had control of a jinn who was able to make things appear and disappear, or it was stories of Yogananda running away from his parents with his friends to try to go and become a yogi in the Himalayas. That for me, simply recalling those stories brought out the lessons. And so I didn't necessarily find it difficult to stay true to those stories. But, what I did want to do was try to show how those same stories still happen today, right? And so I told this story of how he ran away so many times. But in the end, when he finally found his guru, he ended up being closer to home. He was only 18 miles from Calcutta, where he was living at the time. And instead of being up, in Benares or up in the Himalayas, And so, the lesson that I pulled from that was that you don't have to go to the Himalayas, perhaps, right? In his case, he found a teacher that was very close to him. And then I tell stories of people who went very far, including in the United States. One story is of a young movie producer who was working in Hollywood who went all the way to Rishikesh to try to find, the right spiritual teaching. And what he found there was a copy of Autobiography of a Yogi. And then he came back to Los Angeles and found that there was a center right near him. And that became the spiritual path that he decided to follow in Los Angeles. So sometimes the answer may be closer, but simply by, I think, retelling these stories and thinking about these stories. Yogananda, when he told the stories, because he was writing for an American audience, sometimes he needed to have terminology or change the terminology and not talk so much about some of these ancient concepts like karma. But in fact, what I found was there was a thread of karma running through many of these stories, but it was written in a way that was both understandable and digestible for people who wouldn't necessarily know those terms, which today people in the West know those terms as much as.
When you talk about, you were telling these stories that appear too good to be true, and then there are young people who might not really believe in that. And also, there's some people who have given review on this book. For example, Robert Moss says that it's highly recommended both for those who have cherished Yogananda from childhood and those who are discovering him only now. So that was my question, that how do you think this will help people who haven't really read Yogananda or who are just starting to read his autobiography or delve into his teachings?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I believe that the lessons that he's been teaching with his stories are fairly timeless. But, as I said, there's a whole generation of people that may not have read Autobiography of a Yogi, and it's a long book. It's a 500-page book. And oftentimes people don't read it the first time they come across it. I mean, that happened to me. I had seen it in the bookstore many times, and it wasn't until I was assigned the book by a meditation teacher that I actually sat down and actually started to go through it. And then I found that the stories were so colorful that it was very easy to remember them afterwards. But I think, for people who haven't read Autobiography of a Yogi, I have distilled, these many, many stories down into 14 lessons. And I think that they will be able to read my book if they're coming at this, as a modern person who's used to technology, who understands the language of the internet, understands streaming and video games, and will be able to relate to it from that perspective. Because most of us are not monks who are going to go and, be in a monastery. Most of us work a regular job. We might be in the media industry. We might be, in my case, I was in the computer industry, right? And so I believe that wisdom of a yogi is a way for someone who is living a regular material life but has spiritual ambitions to start learning those lessons and internalizing those lessons. And then as they go through my book, they can then go and read the full stories, within Autobiography of a Yogi. And so it becomes a way, a gateway, if you will, into reading, this longer work that has many more stories than obviously I'm recounting within my book, but it's a more digestible way to get started.
And you said you read the book first in 1999, but during the research process of writing this book, did you come across anything new, anything interesting from Yogananda's life, which you sort of rediscovered and were fascinated by?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I during the writing of this book, I not only obviously reread, all of the stories in Autobiography of a Yogi, but also I read many biographies that had been written about Yogananda, including one by a gentleman named Philip Goldberg here in the U.S., as well as, researched his life online. And what I found was that, Yogananda told many stories in his book about his time in India, right? But he didn't tell a lot of stories about his time in America, and yet he spent most of his adult life, going between initially in Boston, and then he drove all the way across the country to California, and that's eventually where he settled in Los Angeles, which is on the Pacific Ocean. And so I discovered many stories, including many setbacks, right? I mean, sometimes we think, well, Yogananda, when you read his book and you read some of these stories and these miraculous things are happening, and he meditates and he prays for something and it happens, and you think, wow, this guy had no problems. That turns out not to be the case. If you look at his life, he had many, many setbacks after he arrived. And even, in fact, there's a story of when he was on the boat, and it took him, many weeks, many months, as a matter of fact, to get here, where he was asked to give his first lecture in English, and he just froze for 10 minutes, and he couldn't bring himself, and then he did a silent prayer to his guru, and then eventually he found the strength and just started talking. But he had entire setbacks where he had become one of the best known swamis in America, and meditation and yoga teachers. And then his whole organization fell apart because of some scandals involving another Swami who was one of his friends from Calcutta who had joined him here. And then he had to start all over again. And at that point, he was in a state where he's like, please, God, can I just go back to India and not worry about running an organization and managing all these people? And that's something we can relate to. I, as an entrepreneur, can relate to this because I've had companies where I've had a certain number of employees, and then we have some issue with our sales, and suddenly we can't make payroll, which is exactly what happened to him. He had to deal with all these financial issues. And so I learned, that he stuck with it. He kept up the principles and the lessons that I talk about within this book, kept his faith during these tough times, and that eventually led him to the path that was to be his legacy, which really was from this book, Autobiography of the Yogi. So there were many setbacks like that I hadn't known about before. But one of the lessons that I extract, even though it's not necessarily explicit in Autobiography of the Yogi, it's in his life, which is that sometimes setbacks are part of our story, right? If he hadn't had that setback, he might not have written this book, because he decided, rather than building a big organization after that setback, he wanted to find ways to communicate with more people. So sometimes in our lives, the setbacks that we encounter actually help us to set us on the next step of our path and the contribution that we're here to make in this life.
Absolutely. And do you have any advice on how people should approach this book? Because it's been written very interestingly that you are taking stories and then you talk about the lessons that people can derive from that. But do you have any other instructions for young people or people for the uninitiated to read this book?
Yeah, I would say for the uninitiated, you can just open up the book to any chapter. You don't have to start with the introduction where I talk about Yogananda's life. You don't need any of that. So it depends a little bit about, what you're most interested in. If you're interested in what I call the Swami superpowers, right? The cities, as they're called in the yogic tradition, you can start in those chapters. And in those chapters, I not only retell some of the stories of for example, of materialization, Swamis who materialized in more than one place. I asked the question, do we think this really happened? Was this an exaggeration that Yogananda was telling us to impress his Western audience? And so you can, if you're more of a skeptical scientist type, you can also start with some of those chapters, because those chapters draw you in to the story. So you learn about the story, but you also learn about some of the context. And so, my advice is just pick up the book and check out one of the chapters and lessons, the one that calls out the most to you. I mean, one of the lessons is about, as I said earlier, following the clues, which is like a treasure hunt. So I think that our lives are like an Indiana Jones film, which some of you may have seen, the films like Raiders of the Lost Ark, where he's looking for a treasure, but they never give him the exact location of the treasure at the beginning of the movie. He has to follow, and once he follows that clue, it leads him where? To the next clue. And that's what makes the movie fun, but he also has to have setbacks along the way. And so I would say find the thing that intrigues you the most, or just choose something randomly as your starting point. And from there, follow the clues of your own interests, whether it's through my book or as you read one or two of those chapters, you may want to stop and go read those chapters in Autobiography of the Yogi. So there are many different ways, to approach this book if you haven't read Autobiography of the Yogi.
And what do you hope would be some of the key takeaways that readers would take from the book?
Well, I think the key takeaways include, taking some time every day to quiet your mind, and really understanding that, yoga is less about, the physical postures, the asanas, right? Than it is about stilling our thoughts, and about kind of taking the storm of what were called vrittis, or whirlpools of thought and emotion and desire. And for those who have learned about these concepts in English, I often think that the translations have lost something, and so I go back and try to rework those translations in a way that would be more clear to modern readers as well. And I think also that the general lesson that to use your intuition, because as Yogananda said, that intuition is soul guidance, and if you quiet your mind, you can find the right path. But it helps to have these reference points of stories where people have done that in the past, because it gives us more confidence to be able to do that in our own lives. And so, those are some of the lessons, but there's quite a few more in the book as well.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for speaking with us. It's been a pleasure. And I would just like to show the book again, Wisdom of a Yogi by Rizwan Virk, and it's published by HarperCollins India. So please pick your copy and let us know how you like the book. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.